Hello, I'm Stevie Thurston and welcome back to The Wounded Man. In this episode we're going to look at an article from the Journal of Forensic Anthropology. The title is Skeletal Trauma, nice and simple. These are the people who wrote it. There will be a link in the further information underneath this video. That should take you to an open source PDF of it so that you can download it and read it for yourself. It's definitely worth having a look at. It is an older article, as you can see, 2010. It's a review of the forensic stuff that's available over that period in some ways. So it's a little outdated, but it gives a nice brief overview of the different types of skeletal trauma, and it's definitely worth a read. It defines the 4 types of skeletal trauma as being blunt force trauma, sharp force trauma, ballistics trauma, and explosives and burning trauma. Now, I'm not going to go into a huge amount of depth on each of those now. I'm just going to give you a bit of an overview, a bit of an introduction to the concepts, and I'm going to do individual videos on the chapter on blunt force trauma and the section on sharp force trauma, as it's more relevant to us, and it should allow us to keep these videos nice and simple. So they define blunt force trauma as low velocity impacts of a large surfaced area weapon. By low velocity, they're talking about something which is controlled by the hand. It's not talking about projectiles or dropped objects or anything like that. They're looking at something that's relatively low velocity and has no sharp edge. So interesting, that gives us a bit of a dilemma between sharp force and blunt force for some of the medieval weaponry. Obviously, they're looking from a modern forensics point of view, forensic sciences for criminal investigation and things. So they're looking at, you know, hammers, baseball bats, clubs, you know, the sort of things you'd expect to find now. In an archaeological sense, yeah, we're going to have hammers and clubs, war hammers and war clubs and things like that. But we're also going to have things like maces, and a flanged mace may well have sharp edges. So we may actually have something that fits into both the category of blunt force and sharp force trauma, but that's something we'll sort of look at later on once we get into it. So sharp force trauma, they define as being both low and high velocity impacts made by a weapon which has a sharp edge. When we do the video on it, we'll look at what they define as sharp edges and how it quantifies within assessment on skeletal remains. They also briefly point out that we need to look at weapon classes rather than weapon types. So this is quite relevant to us. They sort of particularly reference the fact that the tests with, or tests have been done with a scalpel, a paring knife and a kitchen knife. And that there was variation within the forensic signatures that were made by those weapons, and that those weapons, those forensic signatures overlapped, so they weren't able to say for definite this is definitely a scalpel, paring knife or a kitchen knife, and therefore they would fit them all into the same category of basically as small bladed knives, and that kind of makes sense. Something we're going to look at in further detail. I'll explain a bit more in the next video on sharp force trauma, but it's the sort of stuff that we're going to start looking at quite specifically once we start getting into these and start doing some experimentation and stuff. So they're the 2 main types. They're the 2 ones that I'm going to do, well, 2 main types that are relevant to us. And that's what I'm going to do the following videos on. On top of that, as I said, they had ballistics trauma. They are dealing very specifically within modern context and are looking specifically at firearms. It's worth having a read. As I say, I'm not going to go over it, but it will be worth having a read because it will become relevant to us. Mass graves from Europe, in the periods that we're sort of looking at, 15th and 16th century, we do start to see the development of firearms, cannons, muskets, that kind of thing. And when we start looking at the mass graves, then obviously there are going to be skeletons in there that potentially display ballistics trauma. But the article doesn't really go into it that much. They're very much focused on the weapon, and that they feel that there needs to be a very good understanding of the weapon and the mechanics of how those weapons work in order to be able to assess the trauma. And as I say, it's going to be interesting reading. It's definitely worth having a look at. And the final piece is the explosives and burning trauma. They fit the burning very much within the explosive trauma. And they're looking very much at a modern context of explosives. So while there is historical evidence of grenades and Greek fire and things being used within the medieval period, in the later medieval period, and the early post-med, they're dealing with very much improvised explosive devices and hand grenades, modern military type stuff. Again, interesting, probably not something that we're going to find cropping up in our studies too much. As I said, we're going to look very much at the late medieval period and the early postmodern, the Renaissance. So that's the article. As I say, links down below. Have a read. Hopefully you'll come back and watch the other videos where we'll just go into a bit more information, a bit more discussion about what they're talking about, and hopefully that'll give us some pointers for moving forwards. So thank you very much for joining us, and hopefully we'll see you next time.